Slides 98 to 119, plant structures and reproduction. Up to this point, we've only talked about animals and how the strategies that animals use to reproduce, why it's critical, things they do to help them. Now we're going to talk about plants and the ways plants make sure they can reproduce and make more plants. Okay. As we have stated earlier, plants have a form of asexual reproduction. So if it's asexual, how many parents? One parent. Called vegetative propagation. Most plants can propagate a leaf, root, or stem if they get enough water, minerals, and sunlight. Plants can also reproduce sexually. So there are male plants and female plants. And on some plants, they actually have both male and female parts on the same plant. And we're going to talk about all of those. The male sex cell is the pollen. Female is the ovule. When fertilization takes place, DNA from both parents is mixed, and there is variation. So even in plants, if you have a male plant and a female plant, that offspring from that plant is going to have variation. JR, are you listening, or what are you doing? Okay. So even on even plants, I don't know, if you go and you're talking about flowers, or you go and you plant like a tomato plant for your garden, okay? Well, someone, usually a scientist, has actually taken part of that male reproductive organ and part of that female and put together that tomato plant to make it, whether it be a certain color or a certain variety or have a certain taste.
Wait. Scientists have to do that?
Mm-hmm. And you can do it manually, but when you go and buy that seed or that plant that's already ready to go, someone has actually manipulated it to look or be the way you want it when you go to the grocery store or your plant store to buy it. Yes?
It's like the Impossible Burger. They show how it's made out of plants.
Yeah.
For these
Plant requirements for sexual reproduction. So here we're talking about a male and female plant. Like animals, plants have conditions necessary for the creation of new offspring. Yes, they must find a mate. Now, not in the traditional sense the animals do, but we had when I lived in Heron, we had a tree that was actually a coffee tree. But the reason it didn't produce coffee is because we only had the male version of this tree. So it had the seeds, but it was never fertilized, so it never turned into actual coffee. So plants actually do have to find a way to find a mate. How do you think that pollen or that seed could get from, bless you, one place to the next?
By bees and other...
Bees. Pollination is a big one.
Wind.
Wind, very good. Another one?
Animals.
Animals transfer it, very good. And actually water will actually work as a transfer of the pollen as well. Getting the pollen to the female part of the flower is the first order of business for the plant. This is called pollination. Plants must create a seed. This is an equivalent to an egg, and the plants must increase the odds of that seed sprouting in some way. I would really know this slide if I were you. Plant sexual structures. Okay. The organ of the reproduction of the plant is the flower. The flower is the reproductive organ. The male part is called the stamen, which is made up of the filament and the anther, also very important. The female part of the flower is the pistil, which includes the stigma, style, and ovary, which contains the ovules, also very important. Male flower structures. The filament. So this right here is the filament. Is the stalk, which lifts the pollen higher on the flower. So it's actually going to push the pollen up higher so it can be exposed. Yes, question?
Why does it look like cat puke up close?
Well, it's just magnified. It's just like the little seeds of pollen. You've seen it like, you know, in your flowers or whatever. It's like that little yellow powdery stuff that's like down on the inside of the plant. Okay. The anther hold on, I lost my spot. The filament is the stalk which lifts the pollen high on the flower. The anther, can't really see that very well. I forget I can erase it with my finger. Makes the pollen. Together they are called the stamen. So here's the pollen, here's your filament. All of this together is called the stamen. Very important. Female flower structures include the stigma, which is sticky to catch the pollen. So that pollen is almost just like little dust particles almost. So this has like a stickiness to it, so then it sticks right to it. The style is the long tube which the pollen goes through to meet the ovules in the ovary. Each ovule can become a seed. Together they are called the pistil. So the pistil is the stigma, style, and ovary, all very important. Here's the anther, the style, ovary, those are the ovules, and this is the stigma. All right, which arrow points to the anther? A, B, C, D, E, F, or G? Anther. Go ahead, Neve.
C.
C is correct. Which arrow points to the structure which holds the ovule? Going with A?
No,
F.
F?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So down here,
Yep, yep.
F, and that is called the ovary. Okay. The arrow is pointing to the pistil, stamen, petals, or sepal.
A.
So this is the pistil. Requirement number 1, pollination. I think Parker already mentioned to us about pollination. We talked about bees, other insects. How when that bee travels from one plant to the next, it picks up that pollen and then transfers it to plant to plant to plant to plant. So here are where many flowers actually have both male and female parts already on them, so they can literally self-pollinate themselves. Many flowers have both male and female structures. It does not increase variation unless the pollen and ovules come from 2 different individuals. So the problem with that is, let's take like a vegetable plant as an example. What if the one vegetable plant that you have already has a disease? What's going to happen?
It's gonna die.
The offspring of that plant is also going to have that disease because it's literally just making a copy of itself. But if you are getting pollen from other plants brought in, there's a better chance that that offspring then will not have that same disease because it's getting variation from 2 different plants.
Presumably that asexual reproduction can be done with, well, yeah. You know what I'm trying to say.
Okay. In some plants, in some plants, it's going crazy.
Keep going.
In some plants, the pollen and ovules do not mature at the same time. All the pollen must go to another plant. All the ovules must be fertilized from another plant. Some flowers or plants have only male or female, and they cannot self-pollinate. The loblolly pine trees have separate male and female structures. Pine trees have cones instead of flowers. Pollination. Pollination specifically is the transfer of pollen from an anther to a stigma of the flower. The stigma is often sticky or has tiny hairs to catch pollen when it lands. This photo shows self-pollination. If the pollination goes to a different flower, it's called cross-pollination. Very important. If it pollinates itself, self-pollination. If another plant is involved, it's cross-pollination.
Seems pretty easy to remember.
Seems like it would be to me. Pollination requires outside help. There are many forms of pollinators. Someone said bees, we've mentioned, wind, water, what else did we mention? And other animals.
dust.
Well, that's kind of the wind would move that around. Okay, pretty good list. Random pollinators. Wind and water are random carriers of pollen. Success can only be increased, I don't know why it keeps messing up on me, if a large amount of pollen is released. This is literally pollen floating in the water. This floating pollen from the nearby tree.
Dissolve it.
Huh?
How doesn't it dissolve?
It doesn't, it just floats along the
That's
top.
a lot of pollen.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
I went to a beach
I've seen
like
that
that. It was pretty
If I
bad.
saw that, I thought it would have looked like cat puke.
Yes? Okay, that's enough with
It
cats.
feels like
I've
it.
Yes.
been hiking and it was like this part of a wall where the water is still and it's dirty.
Mhm.
Because that whole pollen was covered.
Yes, yes. So this pollen, I don't know why this is hopefully, it's going to run into some other trees or some other flowers. That's its hope. To get pollinators to come to a flower, the plant needs to provide an incentive for the animal. The most known are bees, of course. Bees use the pollen as food to make honey. They fly from flower to flower, collecting the food. Some pollen falls off and then fertilizes the flower.
That one looks like it's disguised as the
The cost of pollination. Providing food or shelter for animals is a high energy cost for the plant. Lots of pollen and lots of, perfumey, smell good from the plant takes a lot of energy for that plant to do that. This ant gets sweet nectar from the plant, and then the flowers get pollinated from the ant. Male wasps carry females when they mate. This hammer orchid takes advantage of this fact